This Fed Gov Today program is sponsored by Booz Allen. On this edition of Fed Gov Today with Francis Rose, the Pentagon's software acquisition pathway is the only pathway now. A consolidation to solve a cloud full of challenges, and one big zero trust pillar gets a huge boost from DISA. Welcome to Fed Gov Today with Francis Rose. The Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, says every department component should use the software acquisition pathway to buy software. Hegseth writes that he's directing the components of the pathway as, quote, the default solicitation and award approaches. Paul Puckett is Chief Technology Officer at Clarity Innovations. He's former Director of Enterprise Cloud Management at the Army. Keith Jones is President and CEO of the Edgewater Group. He's former Chief Information Officer at the State Department. Gentlemen, welcome. Thanks for joining me. Paul, what's the intersection that you see of the software edict that Secretary Hegseth wrote about and the cloud work that you did at the Army and the work that people are still doing in the cloud in the services?
Yeah, the cloud is, quite frankly, the pathway when it comes to available infrastructure to prove value when it comes to fielding software. If you look at the history for how typically software capabilities have been fielded, these massive hardware acquisitions to support the infrastructure to deploy the software onto takes a lot of time. And so typically that's why you see a lot of the waterfall methodologies being employed in the past, is simply because of the limitation of infrastructure. So when cloud came online, especially starting in 2014 with the CIA leading for C2S, and then the DoD leaning further, right, as you see in 2018, 2019, beyond, now we have on-demand infrastructure to be able to now field capabilities. And so naturally that cloud infrastructure really functions like software. Really, it's an interface to spin up the resources that you need. And so starting to now field software in an iterative manner just makes absolutely perfect sense. And so quite frankly, it's the only place to enable the speed and the scale by which we need to be fielding software solutions today. So there's naturally a perfect complement between the two. How
different is what Secretary Hegseth is telling people they have to do now from what they were already doing?
Well, it's not too terribly different. If you look at the software acquisition pathway, it was driven out of the NDAA from FY18 saying, hey, study better ways for us to do software. And so the DIB leaned in, so the Defense Innovation Board leaned in and created their software study that they had. So it's been around from a knowledge perspective from 2019 and in law as a capability since 2020. The challenge has always been understanding how to leverage it and truly what agile and iterative software delivery actually means. We're so used to saying it's got to do this, this, this. We have all these big R requirements that we put out there, which oftentimes requires us to know the future. I always say it's a world of prophecy. And essentially you hope that you built the right thing and you fielded the right thing. That's typically how we addressed it before. Now it's just simply saying, hey, software is eating the world. We have to respond in an iterative manner. We've got to prioritize this methodology of delivering versus other typical major system or minor system acquisitions from a FAR-based perspective.
Keith, welcome. It's great to see you again. Thanks for coming on today. What's the difference between what the Defense Department is doing and what the civilian agencies are doing, or the difference between what they're doing and what they should be doing on the civilian side?
Yeah, on the civilian side, I would say for more than a few years now, cloud adoption and moving to a very iterative design process and making sure you were delivering with good cadence, frequent deliveries versus a long 18-month delivery where you would see most times in government programs, getting to 2-week sprints of what you call, where you also have people from contracting, the mission side, and various lines of business, as well as IT, being educated on the whole Agile DevSecOps methodology. Really important in order to get everyone on the same page and move at the right cadence and right speed, and you get a lot of more frequent delivery and software acquisition.
And I think maybe the most important thing that you mentioned there is having the mission delivery people involved as partners in that process. Is that right, Keith?
Exactly, and I can go back to my days at DHS. Didn't seem that long ago, but when you start thinking about it, it was a long time ago. You go back to the days at DHS where we engaged everyone and trained everyone from contractors to contracting officers, contracting specialists. We had mission personnel from all over, as well as our staff, where we educated them on the process, challenged them, and how we knew it was working, everyone was communicating. It was no longer having one meeting and waiting for something. It was always happening.
But Paul, the first thing I thought of when I saw this memo was, I wonder how this affects or changes the role of the software factories in the various services? What's your sense of that?
I think there's a natural complement there as well. If you look at history, the whole purpose around the software factory movement was for the government to get better at understanding what good software looks like. And that's not just, oftentimes it was these are just engineers or developers, but it's much bigger than that. It includes the acquisition officers, the contracting officers, the product and program managers, managers driving where we're trying to go, balancing strategic needs and customer feedback. Quite frankly, if you look at the software workforce today, the predominant workforce that understands how to execute against this memo are the software factories, now coupled with major programs leaning into a new methodology. I think historically, a lot of times, software factories get labeled as this, GOTS versus COTS competitive nature, and that's just simply not true. The whole movement at the beginning was just to get better at how software can be delivered and understanding the iterations, along the way.
Yeah.
What's striking? Oh, go ahead, Keith.
I was going to say, let's not forget the cybersecurity piece as well, right? Making sure that cybersecurity is built in from the beginning, right? Working with the programs, working with the product owners, working with managers across the organization to make sure that everything is tight going forward, and you don't get to this point where you have a product ready to go and you're waiting on authority to operate. You don't want to do that. Everything's built in and everyone's working in one cadence.
Are the agencies getting better at that? I'll come back to you in a minute, Paul. Do you think agencies are getting better?
Absolutely. I think you've seen a lot of maturity over the last 4 to 5 years where everyone understands that cybersecurity is so important and to build it in from the beginning versus to adapt it at the end.
What did you want to add, Paul?
Well, it goes bigger than just cybersecurity. So if you look at the movement of the software factories, we saw platform technologies to accelerate delivery of software into the ecosystem, continuous ATOs being baked in from the beginning. But if you think of how major systems are fielded, we have to talk about system interoperability with other systems. There are processes for verifying that you're not going to break another system. There are processes that verify when it comes to safety of life, right? You've got to make sure that all these things are incorporated into how you're fielding this technology. One of my favorite documents of the software study from the DIB was called Detecting Agile BS. And one of the elements of that was saying, are all of the elements of your project and all the dependencies on your project agile as well? Because you can make a software acquisition pathway and say, we're going to build software this way, but if your security processes are still waterfall, if your interoperability processes are still waterfall, anything along the way, especially with interactions with your customer, if those are just single point in time to never be seen again, you're doing agile BS. All of those places and all those choke points are going to get identified as this memo gets executed.
I was going to say also that one of the things that's very successful in organizations, you take the person or individual that's your biggest hurdle, you put them in the middle of agile delivery and say your job and responsibility is to make things happen. All of a sudden, their cadence changes. And you start seeing things more iteratively, and they start to catch on and say, hey, we got to do this faster. We can't wait.
One thing that struck me, Paul, about the software factories is the composition of the workforce in those. There's a really interesting mix of civilian, DoD people, uniformed people, and contractors. It's not all just we're going to hire contractors to come in and teach us how to do software.
Yeah, it's a little bit of everything, but the reality at the end of the day is, is government trying to compete with industry? I think in a number of spaces, there's no need to. Industry is thriving, but the government needs to understand what good software looks like. Because if you have no clue what good software looks like and you're trying to make decisions of even like what best commercial solutions to bring into the space, or oftentimes where the government is making smaller acquisitions, which means interoperability is a government integration challenge, you want government leadership to understand what good architecture and good software looks like. And really that's the cornerstone of the people from a workforce perspective being built up. It's not to now compete and build everything themselves. It's to make sure that they're being good partners and good stewards of taxpayer dollars to pull in the right stuff at the right time for the right reasons.
Keith, we just have a minute or so left, but I wanted to ask you something you told me before we went on the air that you're also tracking, is what CIOs are working on now and maybe should be working on now as they're starting to interface with the DOJ teams that are coming to their agencies, or as they're preparing to do so. Inevitably, that will happen over the next several weeks and months. What are you advising people to do in that situation right now?
Yeah, I'm saying that from what I see, CIOs should be looking carefully at their programs, starting to do their own scrub, right? And making sure that they understand the delivery cadence, they understand what's being delivered, they understand what the cost is. What is it really costing in order to run some of these programs? Looking at these larger areas where there's typical overhead and there's been this constant inflationary adjustment, and do some zero-based budgeting, right? Because that's the best way to educate yourself on what's going on, especially when you have a large organization under you. There's so many things going on at one time, but start looking at some of these key programs, even the mid-level programs and even the smaller ones. Where are the opportunities? Where are the efficiencies? What are the things that are by law and statutes that you must have in place? And these are the things that we can say, opportunities to make things better.
It's great to have both of you on the show. Thanks,
Thank
Keith.
you.
Thanks, Paul, for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
You can read more about the new Pentagon software policy and find a link to the SecDef's memo on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. Up next, a consolidation to solve a cloud full of challenges. Fed Gov Today with Francis Rose. Be right back.
Personally, it's more about the performance and the use cases of the technology. But in order for me to get to play around with it in my region, it has to go through either some kind of cybersecurity standards. Yeah.
Zero Trust is transforming cybersecurity across government. You'll learn what it takes to put it into action on Zero Trust in depth. You'll meet leaders from DISA, the State Department, the Government Accountability Office, and Booz Allen talking about the strategies and challenges shaping Zero Trust today. This special program presented by Booz Allen is available now on demand. Watch anytime at fedgovtoday.com. Welcome back. The Defense Department's laying the groundwork now for a new cloud computing contract. John Hale, Chief of Product Management and Development at the Defense Information Systems Agency, says the contract should be ready next fall. Richard Crowe is Civil Sector President at Booz Allen. Rich, welcome. It's great to see you again. A lot of organizations all across government, especially DOD and civilian organizations, are talking about the success they're having with multi-cloud. That's why DOD is moving to its next iteration of cloud. What's driving the success of a multi-cloud configuration in your view?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One, we're, in the federal space, we're about 10 years into adopting cloud. So there's a lot of best practices and lessons learned that we can take and apply to other agencies and across agencies as they expand their cloud footprint. There's also a lot of lessons learned from commercial best practices, and the two are really converging in a way that's accelerating cloud adoption across federal agencies. We're seeing more and more agencies as they continue on their journey of modernization adopt cloud and now starting to look at multi-cloud environments.
You wrote recently about the delivery of mission-tailored, never-fail software systems that are dependent on the cloud. That title is really, I think, sums up exactly what these systems have to do, doesn't it?
Sure, absolutely. When you have life safety missions and you have missions that are really important for public safety, for national security, it's really important that the reliability of these systems have to be available 24/7. At the same time, they have to be built on, combination of sound mission fundamentals, as well as strong technology. And part of that is then making sure that the mission owner is in the center of that, so that they're surrounded both by tech and mission insight. So the third leg of that stool is really having a human-centered design around that, so as you're tailoring out that mission for never fail, that you're kind of thinking about the operator and the mission holder at the end of the day.
And that syncs with what I was just talking with Paul and Keith about a moment ago, which is having mission delivery people involved in the development of whatever it is you're developing, whether it's the cloud architecture or the software itself.
Oh, absolutely. I think what we're finding really now is agile best practices, where you have the technologists, the mission holders, the program people, and all the people who are surrounding it with all the different requirements are all working in an iterative process, so that at the end of the day you want to have the mission holder and the people who are executing the mission at the center of this, and you're able to really kind of bring the best together.
Another item that you and I have talked about before is how artificial intelligence is either driving this forward or maybe changing the direction of how the concepts of cloud and software development and so on move forward. What are you seeing in that now?
Well, it's really driving it in a number of dimensions, right? We're using now, for modernization, we're using AI to help the modernization cycle, taking old code, reverse engineering it, and then kind of refactoring it at a faster pace. We're also using AI in IT operations, so to help how to help with deployments across the enterprise, using AI more effectively on the IT operations side. And then I think just even in helping the operators in decision-making process by better use of data, enabling that mission with data, and then really helping with some of the decision-making process to help the operator get the data that they need and make real-time decisions at the speed of business.
One of the items that you wrote about recently is leveraging AI to automate data cleanup and standardization, as you just mentioned. Mm-hmm. The standardization to me seems to be as important, or maybe more important, than the cleanup, so that systems can talk to each other outside of the silos of individual organizations. Am I on the right track there?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things we're finding as as business becomes more and more interconnected across different agencies, it's really important to be able to expose data, share data, do it in a way that's with trust and safety, but also make sure that there's using AI appropriately to kind of like quickly stage the data, move it back and forth. So I think one of the things that we're seeing is put more of a premium on the data engineering to make sure that the data is staged correctly, so that you can build a wraparound systems, whether you're using a COTS product, you're building up a special system for it, or whatever. It really boils down to is the data is becoming more and more the currency that we have to kind of focus on.
We have less than a minute left. Are agencies becoming more amenable to the idea of some type of COTS solution to be able to manipulate the data, use the data the way that you just described than maybe they have been in the past?
Oh, I definitely see more and more COTS adoption, and I think there are a number of data platforms that are out there that really enable agencies and mission holders to do their work. So we're seeing more and more of that out there, particularly in the civilian agencies where they're just like commercial practices. So they use the COTS systems that are out there, and it's enabling to quickly get modernization and take advantage of what industry is paying for in the broader economy.
Rich, it's great to have you on the show.
Great.
Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me back again.
You can read more about cloud computing and data on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. Up next, one big zero trust pillar gets a huge boost from DISA. Fed Gov Today with Francis Rose continues in a moment.
Some barriers that I do see outside of procurement are limited availability of trained resources in artificial intelligence, right? So both from the industry as well as that. I think government needs to upskill the force, invest in talent acquisition, collaborate and partner with the industry. In that way, they can bridge the gap that we see.
Welcome back. The Defense Information Systems Agency says it's hitting a breakthrough in identity, credential, and access management for the Defense Department. The department lists ICAM as one of the major pillars of its zero trust effort. Brian Hermann is Director and Program Executive Officer at DISA's PEO Cyber. Brian, welcome. It's great to have you on the program. Why is ICAM such an integral part of the zero trust effort that not just DoD is undertaking all across government?
Well, I think it's clear that ICAM is the foundational capability that enables zero trust. You have to understand who a user is and verify that positively before you can decide whether they should have authorization to access a system. And so together, public key encryption and identity credentialing and access management form that foundation.
I read DISA is developing a federation point that will simplify the user experience. In this description of this breakthrough that I referenced, federation is a term that I see on a number of occasions. Why is that term important to the work that you're doing?
So in the context of what we're talking about right now, the federation of ICAM solutions across the Department of Defense means that a user can access a system based on the same authentication point that they're typically using for their own home service applications, but then be granted access through a trust relationship among those ICAM service providers. And so that is the new piece of federation. Sometimes people talk about federation in the context of synchronizing identity data. We provide that function and have for a long time, but the ability to have a streamlined user experience and to make sure that we understand across the department everybody's access is the new part of what federation does for us.
And that streamlined user experience is where I wanted to go next. I'm curious what you're doing to make this as transparent as possible to the end user who doesn't need to know about these changes.
What we really didn't want to have was we didn't want to have a situation where a user had to know which ICAM service that they had to go to access some critical information or a critical application. Instead, we wanted to make sure that they could go to the same place for that purpose. So an Army user can go to an Army ICAM solution and then be granted access to something that is either a Navy system or somewhere else in the Department of Defense without having to wonder where they should be going. And that's enabled right now. We've completed the Federation efforts with the Army as our first service, and now we're moving through with the rest of the services. What
was special about the Army that caused you to want to start with them, or that they asked you to start with them? How did that process work?
Honestly, it was willingness and the maturity of their system. So they were willing to understand that first attempt to federate would likely, produce some challenges, and that it did. But we worked through those fairly quickly. Largely, these are not technical problems; it's procedural problems that we work through, and we expect to see faster pace as we go to the other services because of the experience that we had with the Army as well.
That was where I wanted to go next. What did you learn from that implementation process that you could apply with the other services?
We essentially established a process that we will go through and some guidelines for each of the services to understand what to expect when we go through. The most interesting questions that we kept getting as we started to talk about federation was, well, what does it look like technically and how would we go about doing that? And so now we can give them some solid answers. We had thoughts on what that might look like, but the implementation of federation and the process of bringing the Army in ended up being fairly straightforward, and we think it'll be even better as we go forward. And we were able to leverage common tools from industry versus trying to create something special for the Department of Defense. And since each of the solutions that are being implemented across the department leverage similar common tools, not necessarily the same common tools, we're actually able to feel real confident technically that the federation will work out well.
Is success measured in this area as a user tries to use it and it works, so it works, or is it more complicated than that for you to measure that you're on the right track?
I think there's probably a little bit more than just, so from a user's perspective, they're normally thinking about their day-to-day access. So the authentication point for their system is the key place where they think of ICAM. But there's some other pieces behind ICAM that they haven't probably thought about. And we had a paper-based process in the Department of Defense called a DD Form 2875 that provided all the approvals for somebody to be granted access to a system or to data. And that is an antiquated way of doing things. And so part of ICAM is the automated account provisioning process, which takes the identity information that we have, we establish some metrics and attributes about a user, and then we go through an automated process to allow them access to a system. And then that's all logged, so we know everything Brian has access to within the Department of Defense, and we can take action if something looks anomalous there as well. So we streamline the process of authorizing users, and then we have security around the process of authenticating those users.
It sounds like that's the broader connection to the digital experience for each user, rather than just, I mentioned ICAM is an important pillar of zero trust, but it sounds like you're thinking about the entire digital experience for the user.
Absolutely, and by the way, I don't limit that to DoD users. We have systems across the Department of Defense that have a need to work with other federal agencies. We have systems, and one that comes to mind is in U.S. Transportation Command. They have to think about logistics and transportation of shipments for the department around the world. And that means that they have mission partners in industry that will never have a common access card. And so we have to find a way to make sure that they can have access for that use case. And so it's really challenging. And I think ICAM eventually is also going to be the key part of how we establish a level of trust between the U.S. and our allies and coalition partners going forward as well.
What has to happen in order for that vision to be fulfilled, do you think?
So some of that is in place in some policy. I think those policies need to be updated to not just reflect our closest allies, but they also have to reflect the fact that we're working sometimes with changing and shifting coalitions and allied partners. And so establishing a way to set the standard of expectations under which we will allow the trust. We have to have a certain level of maturity of the capabilities on the part of our mission partners. And then we have to have probably the ability to be agile, perhaps in cutting off that trust if that's no longer warranted going forward.
We have about a minute left. Do you have a sense of a timeline yet for when you will be integrating, as you mentioned, with the other services beyond the Army?
So we will be completing the Navy and the Air Force this fiscal year. And move on as all of the other ICAM solutions become available across the department. I think probably the other key piece of what we're trying to accomplish is not just delivering capabilities for ICAM, but we're also having to establish that those ICAM solutions need to be adopted by application owners and data owners. And so they need to hit the targets by the end of FY26. All the financial applications in the department have to have adopted ICAM and automated account provisioning so that we can achieve a clean audit for the Department of Defense. And that's an important milestone for us as well.
It's great to have you on the program, Brian. Thanks for your information today.
Thank you.
You can read more about DISA's ICAM breakthrough on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. On the Fed Gov Today podcast this week, you'll learn how the Department of Homeland Security may help your agency's remote identity verification efforts. You can follow the Fed Gov Today podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your shows. And you can always listen on demand at fedgovtoday.com. Fed Gov Today continues in a moment.
Figuring out how do I operationalize AI to where it really makes a difference. There's a lot of vendors who are talking about AI, and it's fantastic because it's developing a lot of new innovation. But we still need to figure out how do I best operationalize it to where it's meaningful to my mission. That is where I think a lot of the groups are struggling today.
Welcome back. In today's event spotlight, ACT IAC's Emerging Technology and Innovation Conference will feature government and industry collaboration again this year on the most pressing issues the federal government faces. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, 5G communication, and cybersecurity are just a few of them. The conference is coming May 4th through 6th at the Hyatt Regency Chesapeake Bay in Cambridge, Maryland. You can read more about it and register at fedgovtoday.com/events. Fed Gov Today TV returns next Sunday morning at 10:30. The Chief Information Officer of the Navy, Jane Rathbun, will be here. I'm Francis Rose. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Have a great week.